This podcast contains our own personal views not associated with any organisation. Coronial contains descriptions of death inquests that may be graphic and disturbing to some listeners. Discretion is advised. Hi everyone, and welcome back to today's episode of Coronial. My name is Emma.
I'm Alice.
And I'm Georgie.
A little bit of a trigger warning, I suppose, with this one before we get stuck into it. This inquest does relate to a death by suicide or someone who has taken their own life. So I thought I'd just flag that from the outset because not something we usually cover. But I thought this was a very interesting case in the context of Coronial as a whole.
Okay.
But I also just wanted to say that this inquest was also requested by the family of the deceased, and it was held in September of 2018.
Okay.
So Marcia Maynard died on the 3rd of October 2015 in Redcliffe, Queensland from a self-administered lethal dose of insulin. She took the insulin sometime between the 29th and the 30th of September 2015. She had booked a hotel room for the 29th of September and was found unconscious in bed by hotel staff on the 30th. The QAS, the Queensland Ambulance Service, was called and it was noted by them that her blood sugar level was very low. There were no drugs or drug paraphernalia found by the Queensland Ambulance Service staff on a search of the hotel room. Mrs. Maynard was taken to the Redcliffe Hospital north of Brisbane, where she remained unconscious and her condition continued to deteriorate until she passed away on the 3rd of October.
When you say there was no drug paraphernalia found, are we talking illegal drugs or they didn't find any evidence of the insulin?
Any evidence of the insulin. So the insulin vial or container wasn't found. She was found with puncture marks in the inside of her elbows. So they know that she had administered either self-administered, which is what they concluded, or someone had administered insulin to her, but they didn't find the vial of insulin or any needles.
Interesting.
In the room.
So, in a hotel, it's probably not that hard because it's not going to act so quickly that you're going to be rendered unconscious immediately. So she could have left her room, gone and disposed of it and come back.
That's
not
their assumption.
Yeah. But also, if she's got needle puncture marks, I would assume that in her elbow, she's actually administered it intravenously, not even. So normally when a diabetic gives themselves insulin, it's subcutaneous, so just in under the skin, and it absorbs slowly and isn't as rapid, whereas giving it intravenously is going to be much more harmful. In that context, obviously it's got its uses.
Yeah, of course.
For specific reasons, but in this context, no.
Yeah. So Mrs. Maynard was a registered nurse.
Right.
And she was employed as a subcontractor at the Woodford Correctional Centre, which is a high security prison facility for male prisoners located approximately 80 kilometres north of Brisbane. At the Correctional Centre, Mrs. Maynard provided general nursing services to prisoners, including a prisoner called Garnet McKello, who passed away on the 24th of November 2012 while in custody. As Mr. McKello died in custody, his death was a reportable death and it was mandatory that a coroner's inquest be held into his death. So as part of the inquest into the death of Mr. McKello, Mrs. Maynard had provided a statement to the investigating state coroner and an inquest was listed to commence on the 7th of October 2015.
Right. Okay.
A few days after her death. Mrs. Maynard had been advised that she was required to attend the inquest as a witness. Mrs. Maynard had engaged the services of a barrister through the Nurses' Union for the purpose of providing evidence for and at the inquest. On the 29th of September, which was the day that she checked into the hotel, Mrs. Maynard wrote a letter to the counsel who was assisting in the coroner's inquest. The letter appeared to have been written in the context of Mrs. Maynard providing a further statement for the inquest, which may have contained material left out in her earlier statement. In the letter, Mrs. Maynard stated, "I now have been told they are gunning for me. Again, I'm sorry, but I'm unable to take the stress of trying to answer anymore."
Wow.
Would it be taken as hearsay now that she is deceased, though?
I'm not sure about that particular evidence, but her other evidence was already...
just that final letter.
I think they still considered it.
Okay.
But obviously in the context of...
Like that specific statement's obviously not going to change much, but I was thinking if there was other information.
No.
Yeah.
So following Mrs. Maynard's death, the coroner's inquest into the death of Mr. McKellar was postponed to a later date, but it still was heard and handed down before the inquest into the death of Mrs. Maynard.
Which makes sense because it had obviously happened
a
few
few
years
right.
before.
So at this point, I thought it might be useful to go through the circumstances surrounding the death of Mr. McKellar as they relate to Mrs. Maynard before talking through the issues considered by the coroner in relation to Mrs. Maynard's death. So the inquest into the death of Mr. McKellar was handed down in July 2016, so 2 years before this one. So the day of and the day before Mr. McKellar's death, he was being housed at the safety unit of the Woodford Correctional Centre as he had recently returned from hospital following cardiac treatment. His medical history included chronic ischemic heart disease with previous heart attacks. In 2009, Mr. McKellar had a heart attack and it had resulted in the diagnosis of triple vessel coronary artery disease and stents were inserted. On 9 November 2012, he developed crushing chest pain and he was transferred to hospital where it was confirmed that he was suffering from another heart attack. He required further treatment, including the coronary stenting of 2 vessels. While in prison, Mr. McKellar was routinely seen by prison medical services and was on a number of medications. So the following evidence is from Mrs. Maynard's witness statement as it relates to conversations and actions that occur between Mrs. Maynard and Mr. McKellar, obviously, who are both deceased.
Yep.
So on the night of the 23rd of November 2012, which was the night before Mr. McKellar passed away, Mrs. Maynard was the only nurse on duty. She conducted a medical assessment on Mr. McKellar by way of measuring blood pressure and oxygen saturation. She recorded in her observation notes that he had no cardiac issues. Mr. McKellar was having difficulty sleeping and Mrs. Maynard received an order from the visiting medical officer to give him diazepam. That night, Mr. McKellar complained to the safety unit officer that he had a heavy sensation in his chest. Mrs. Maynard immediately requested access to the safety unit from the supervisor. Protocol required that there had to be 3 correctional officers present if a cell in the safety unit needed to be entered, so they had to wait around a little bit to give her access, but she was given access to the cell within about 5 minutes. When she saw Mr. McKellar, there were no obvious signs of distress and he was alert and oriented. He was not having chest pains or pain in his arm or jaw or having any trouble breathing. Mrs. Maynard asked if the pain was similar to the pain that he had experienced with his previous heart attacks, and he said that it wasn't. She asked more detail on why he had reported feeling the heaviness in his chest. He said that since waking up that morning, he had experienced soreness, but there had been no change in his condition since the morning.
Right.
2 experts gave evidence that Mrs. Maynard was looking for all the right things and asking the right questions based on what she'd put in her witness statement. For the remainder of the shift, Mrs. Maynard continued to monitor and observe Mr. McKellar, who remained settled throughout the night, and she provided details of her observations to the visiting medical officer. She clocked off, her shift was finished. On the evening of the 24th of November 2012, so the next evening, Mr. McKellar was found in his cell deceased during a regular prison check. The cause of death was ruled as a heart attack, which appeared to be severe and extensive. So he's obviously had a history of heart issues.
Yes, it's not surprising.
And he was probably having a pretty severe episode over an extended period of time.
Yeah.
You know, it wasn't just like the standard movie episode where you have a sudden chest pain and then fall over. This is like a long extended period of him being...
And he's had
maybe getting progressively worse.
You would say, and your heart's getting weaker. And this is his 4th heart attack now. Yeah. So the key issue involving Mrs. Maynard, which is ventilated during Mr. McKellar's inquest, was the recording on her observations that there was no cardiac issues.
Yeah, like did she mean that there were no cardiac issues right now? You know, because obviously he had cardiac issues before.
Yeah.
And he'd just been in hospital for cardiac issues.
Yeah, was she aware that he'd had heart attacks before?
And like it sounds like she had, because she asked him, does this feel like the last time?
But then she's written no cardiac issues. Does she just mean no signs and symptoms right now? Yeah.
Yeah, so in her statement, Miss Maynard confirmed that on commencing her shift, she received a handover to the effect that Mr. McKellar had recently returned from hospital. He hadn't had any chest pain in 6 days and that he was in the safety unit for operational reasons, not medical reasons. So the answer to your question is yes, she did know.
Aware.
She was well aware of that. And there was some criticism in Mr. McKellow's inquest by some experts about the use of that term, but the coroner ultimately found that it was open to find that, as you said, that Mrs. Maynard was not sort of discounting the fact that he had previous cardiac issues, but just at that point in time, in her assessment, he was not experiencing any cardiac.
He wasn't currently having a heart attack.
That's right. Or having any issues. Because remember, this time he didn't even say that, even though he was feeling chest heaviness, he didn't tell her until
later.
Yeah. So the coroner sort of said it's open to that finding, and without her being here to give evidence to her witness statement, there's no way of saying
one or the other.
One or the other. In Mr. Michelow's inquest, the coroner also found that Mrs. Maynard conducted a thorough assessment of Mr. Michellow in response to his report of chest heaviness and made no adverse findings against Mrs. Maynard. So I guess that's the relevant information, background information about what happened with Mr. Michellow.
Would that have been the same had she been alive and at the inquest?
You don't know.
Yeah, like that's the really hard part, that obviously they found no fault of hers, and sounds like there probably wasn't. But could that have been different had she been alive and testified at the inquest?
But it's also like, with that and her not having found anything detrimental towards her, it's just the genuine stress of going through an inquest and how stressful these inquests are for people who potentially have done the right thing the whole way through, but it just because coronial inquests have got such a negative stigma around if you're involved in one in any way.
Especially as a medical, and it's someone who died of a medical issue under your care.
Yeah. But even if you own a business and someone dies within your place of business, or because, I mean, we've seen a lot of business operators who maybe are completely unaware of some function of their business that meant that they become liable. It's a hugely, hugely stressful thing, I believe, having never been involved in one.
Sounds like it would be.
Yeah.
It would be. Can you imagine getting, and like cross-examination and being cross-examined is scary. People are there and their literal job is to discredit you. They are trying to trap you. They're trying to trick you.
And I would have hoped that in like a coronial inquest, it wouldn't be as harsh.
Because, no, it is.
Yeah, that's the thing.
Because they need to get to the bottom of it. And
I think it also becomes really isolating as well, because you feel isolated, say, in the medical context from the rest of your medical staff, because they may not want to be associated with you, or you may not feel like you can reach out to them because you don't want to discuss it with them.
You can't as well. Like you don't want to be found to have been discussing this sort of stuff with like, because you'll get asked that on the stand. Yeah.
So then also your employer, you feel isolated from them because they're generally looking out for themselves.
Of course.
Rather than you.
That's why there's always separate legal representation between individual witnesses and the corporate entity, because they do have separate interests.
Yeah. And so then you're relying on your barrister or legal counsel or indemnity or whatever. They're nobody to you in a sense that like they're not necessarily someone you can confide in and feel secure by. So then who are you left with from an employment stance? So unless you have a very good external security circle of individuals to support you, you really
But even then that's
isolated.
really difficult, because you want to talk to people who you work with because they most understand what you're going through and like the issues surrounding everything. So you can talk to people externally, but they don't necessarily know what you're going through. And also then you have to disclose information that maybe you wouldn't want to. It's tricky. And also you might, when talking to colleagues and stuff as well, you might have to disclose information you don't want to. So it is, I can imagine, to be super isolating. Yeah. Because there are only, there's pretty much no one who's in your position that you can talk to that will be able to sort of empathise with you.
And it also sounds like this prisoner had been a frequent medical visitor. And so you also don't know what relationship she had with this individual.
True.
That she might have actually been quite friendly with him. It might have actually been quite devastating. Sure, he's a prisoner. Sure, he's technically a patient. You don't develop. Yeah, but, the boundary is still just going to be nurse-patient. Yeah, but again, you're generally going to be
upsetting when someone dies.
Exactly, and empathetic and all that. And to know that you were involved in their medical care is also very terrible. So, I'm surprised it doesn't happen more often.
Yeah.
You need a support group for people who have to testify at coroner's inquests.
Or things like, so when you did jury duty, I think you mentioned that you were offered counselling in the context of it being quite extreme. are the courts not then looking at that in alternative situations where it's like,
We do look into that.
we look into that. Okay,
one
because
of
I'm
the-
like,
yeah.
okay, because I was like, should there not be that if you're involved in an inquest, and I guess generally it's, at least in the medical sense, my understanding is it's kind of suggested by your indemnity provider, but like that there's not a lot of other people that are necessarily being like, have you made sure you're looking out for yourself?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That it sometimes will fall on the indemnity provider. Mm-hmm. But that's not who it should be. There should be general standardized ways, I think, to make sure that anyone involved, where it's outside of their norm.
Yeah.
There's experts and things like that, but
Yes.
generally, but even for the coroner or like the coroner's assistants and stuff,
Yeah.
like the subject matter that they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, it's going to be taking a mental toll.
Yeah.
It has to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting because obviously in these cases we sort of talk about different witnesses, particularly not in the expert context, but the context of like people who saw
Yeah.
or were involved in some way
Those
with
who
the death.
witnessed the event.
Witnessed the event
rather
or
than-
they contributed to the event in some way.
Yeah.
And you sort of think, we sort of talk about how, you know, the coroner might have attributed fault to this particular person. And you sort of think, can you imagine being that person and being put on the stand? And we were talking just before about, you know, people denying it and pointing the finger
Yeah.
at other people. Like, it's not good to do that, of
Yeah.
course, from an integrity point of view, but you can kind of see it in the situation because how stressful would that be?
You feel very defensive.
You
Yes.
feel you'd be on
Yeah.
the defense all the
Yeah.
time, and this is your livelihood and this is your life, and
Yeah.
And it's published for public knowledge
Your name
with
is in
your
it.
name
yep,
on the internet.
exactly. And so, like, you think of it in this context where Mrs. Maynard wasn't even really found to have done anything wrong, but even
yeah.
then, because she was so job proud
Yeah.
of what she did, and obviously there's other things,
Yeah.
you know, it's not just this particular stressor. You've got to have other things in
Yes.
order for this to
Yeah.
happen, because we've seen a lot of people go through a lot harder grillings.
But yeah, you wonder about like if someone had sat down with her and said, this is not your fault. This will not scar the rest of your life. This will be something
But you
that
also
get
can't
through.
make that promise
Yeah.
either.
Again.
Yeah.
Someone closer to her somewhere, and
Yeah.
more in this, someone who's professional, etc.
Yeah.
Would that have made a difference? Like there, very much to me seems like there would be some potential somewhere
Yeah. Oh,
to get
definitely.
her to the point of being accepting of the circumstances rather than so
Yeah.
terrified that she felt like she couldn't live anymore.
She didn't
Yeah.
have any other option.
Yeah.
She just so didn't want to do this that
Yeah.
the only way out was out.
Yeah.
That's one of the things, because you can get held in contempt of court though. So like you can refuse to show up to the coroner. It's going to get you in trouble.
Yeah.
But you can
But
also,
you can-
can't you, you can get like a
Exemption.
dispensation. Yeah, like
Yeah. The driver of the motor vehicle
Yeah.
was
was able
exempt.
to, yeah.
I mean, the coroner did that. I think the coroner initiated that.
Yeah, right.
But, or it was suggested that way, but like,
Mm.
There
one
would
would
have to be
assume-
extenuating circumstances.
well, there's also ones where people have refused to answer questions based on their risk of,
Self-incrimination.
Yeah.
yeah,
That wasn't an issue here, though.
it wasn't, but like,
no.
had she approached someone and said
And I think that's the
Yeah.
key
Yeah.
issue. She didn't.
approach, and no, and
Approach.
the coroner's not going to know that she's struggling
No.
because they've
No,
got a
that's
relationship
not
with
there.
her.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I guess could the barrister have identified that kind of stuff?
And we go through all of this.
Okay, cool.
This is all stuff that's sort of
Okay.
discussed. And again, it's really strange, like discussing someone's mental state or point of view or thought process when they're not here
there.
to defend
Yeah.
Yeah.
those things as well. So
And
it's all
explain
very
it.
hypothetical,
Yeah.
but I think it's a very interesting thing and to sort of discuss, especially in the context of just coronial inquests.
Did we actually get much context about her character in terms of
No.
okay,
Oh, wow.
her family life, the rest
Medical
of
history,
what
like
she was
mental health
interested
Got
in?
a little bit
Yeah.
of medical history, not a whole lot, but there was not any context. Don't know how old she was. She
Yeah.
was a grandma,
Okay.
so she was obviously older.
Yeah.
Experienced nurse, but no. So there were multiple issues that were considered by the coroner in Mrs. Maynard's inquest, including, first of all, the source of insulin,
Yeah.
which Miss Maynard took to end her life, and also the various stresses that led to her ending her life, including the requirement for her to provide evidence at the inquest into the death of Mr. Vitello, and why she may have formed this particular belief that they were gunning for her, because that was something that she had left a number of different letters and things, and they just kept on repeating it, and they were just like, we don't understand where she's got that impression from.
Yeah, right. Out of curiosity, was it the same coroner who did his inquest and hers?
Yes. So first, looking at the source of the insulin, Work Health and Safety Queensland conducted an investigation into Mrs. Maynard's death, as the letters written by her and found in her hotel room indicated that she was stressed due to needing to appear in this inquest, which was obviously in relation to employment matters. So that that got Work Health and Safety involved.
Yep.
So Work Health and Safety prepared a report into the death, which included an investigation of where Mrs. Maynard likely sourced the insulin. So as I said, checks with Mrs. Maynard's GP and Medicare records showed that she had not ever been prescribed insulin, so she wasn't a diabetic. The Woodford Health Services unit stored medications, including insulin, to provide to inmates. One of Mrs. Maynard's primary tasks in her role was to administer medication, such as insulin, and she had readily authorised access to insulin at the health unit.
I mean, that's the most logical place that she would have got
Exactly. But as insulin is not a drug of addiction, there's no requirement for it to be stored in a locked cabinet or refrigerator, as it's not a Schedule 8 restricted drug.
Yep.
Unopened insulin prescriptions were stored in the medicine refrigerator at the health unit. Open insulin was kept in a mobile cabinet used by nurses on their rounds. No records were kept on the destruction of insulin after its expiration, and it was ordered on an as-needed basis, meaning there was no specific tally or stocks or audits conducted on the medication.
Yeah, in which it's not a Schedule 8 drug, so the only reason you'd be doing that is for inventory purposes.
Yeah, correct. And that you're not going to keep it.
But it's also prescribed in like a unit, it doesn't come in a tablet. Like it's coming in a liquid form so you're going to give some to someone and then you'll waste the rest of the syringe because it just comes in a pre-filled or something like that.
Yeah, right. So Work Health and Safety Queensland concluded that the storage and disposal procedures were in line with the requirements for Schedule 4 drugs, so nothing to see there.
Yep.
Security at the prison required all persons, including staff, to be searched for prohibited items, including needles, on entering the premises. However, personal property was not searched on exit, so the report concluded that it was probable that Mrs. Maynard accessed the insulin during the course of her employment at the Woodford Correctional Centre and took it with her.
Right, because the search on the way in is so you don't give stuff to the prisoners.
Yeah, exactly.
But on your way out, go nuts.
No,
yeah,
exactly.
because what are you going to take from the prisoners?
What are you smuggling out?
Yeah. Well, apparently insulin and needles.
Well, yes.
So Queensland Police Service was also tasked with conducting an initial investigation into the death and were provided with the handwritten letters that were found in the hotel room. As I mentioned before, there were no needles or other drugs paraphernalia found in the hotel room. The police also checked Mrs. Maynard's car, which had been parked in the hotel basement, and there was no evidence located in her car either.
Interesting.
So how did they discover that it was insulin? She wrote that it was insulin, or
no? I think it's because her
blood sugar level
levels
was really
were very low.
That's right.
And I guess if there's no other explanation for it.
Yeah. And we'll get
what
to a little bit later, but she had sort of mentioned it in passing to some of her colleagues as
but
well.
But also, I find it interesting that she disposed of it. Like, what's the purpose?
I guess have no idea.
Yeah,
I'm not really sure.
Unless it was, I guess, I don't know, being a nurse, you're like, well, I need to
Gotta get rid
dispose
of
of my sharp.
But I would have left it out so that people, I guess she didn't want people to know immediately and give her glucose because
possibly.
the intent of ending her life. Yeah,
maybe.
Okay.
So the hotel records indicated that Mrs. Maynard had attended the hotel on the 28th of September and booked a room for the next day. She checked in around 2 p.m. on the 29th and was found unconscious around 11 a.m. the next day. At that time, it only appeared that the bed had been used, the bathroom had not been used, and the hotel room was otherwise clean. So she's obviously just gone straight into...
Walked in, straight in, disposed of her
why
needle,
she was there.
laid down.
Yeah.
Did she live nearby, or had she
know.
travelled to give evidence at the inquest? Like, it's just interesting that you would do that in a hotel room. But I guess if you live with a partner...
Like, she has a partner, yeah.
You obviously don't want them
to find you because, again, it
takes a while.
Yeah.
She works at Redcliffe and it's a Brisbane Coronial inquest.
Well,
so
no, she works at
Woodford.
the correctional centre, but she was in hospital at Redcliffe.
But the correctional centre was the closest to Redcliffe Hospital, was why.
Well, I'm not really sure because the correctional centre was 80 k's north of Brisbane. I don't know how far Redcliffe is.
I would assume it's the nearest hospital. But
around that area.
It's around that area. So presumably she lives 80 k's north of Brisbane. So she'd only be travelling into Brisbane for the inquest.
Yeah,
so,
that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah. But also I'm like, okay, she might have even just had taken the insulin before she even drove in the
potentially.
car.
They didn't discuss that, but potentially, yeah.
And then just
or even
walked straight
stopped
in.
off at a servo or
Somewhere.
something.
Yeah, to dispose of it before she got there. Yeah.
So the police requested CCTV footage to try and get a better understanding of what Mrs. Maynard may have done to dispose of the needles. But by the time this was requested by the police, they took a while to do it, the footage had already been lost.
Helpful.
I know. There was no swipe card data for the hotel room that had been recorded for that time period. There was swipe card data that Mrs. Maynard had left the basement car park, but no other data to suggest she used any of the other facilities in the hotel. Ultimately, the coroner could not make any findings as to what Mrs. Maynard did with the insulin packaging. However, he did note that there was a garbage room located on the same floor as Mrs. Maynard's room, so it is possible she disposed of it there.
Yeah.
And they hadn't searched that.
That's
so she
annoying.
could have just gone out and chucked it. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
But for the fact that they can't determine exactly where the medication came from.
Yeah, because they don't have the packaging.
Yeah.
But that said, the coroner found that the most possible explanation is that she sourced the insulin from her work.
That seems absolutely fair.
It seems the most logical explanation.
Yeah.
So moving on to the stresses and factors contributing to Mrs. Maynard's death. So during the investigation, police spoke with Mrs. Maynard's family, including her daughter, who noted that her mother was stressed about the upcoming coronial inquest. Mrs. Maynard's husband stated that his wife had been distressed after a 5-hour meeting with a barrister in relation to the coronial inquest. The daughter said that her mother had conducted recent internet searches of euthanasia websites as well.
Okay.
Which was interesting. And it was also noted that Mrs. Maynard had arranged to have her affairs put in order, including updating her will and changing her power of attorney.
Yeah, okay, all of those are relatively suspicious activities for ending your life.
Yeah.
This wasn't a spur of the moment decision.
No, it was
necessarily.
clearly
She obviously put some
planned.
planning into it.
Yeah. So the particular issues and stress factors the coroner considered, which we'll also discuss, obviously the requirement to give evidence into the death of Mr. McKellar, including meetings with legal representation, but they also considered Mrs. Maynard's physical health, including that she had some recent weight loss, Mrs. Maynard's mental health, and also the support that she got from her employer.
Yeah.
So it was evident from multiple conversations that Mrs. Maynard had with family and colleagues, and from her other actions that we just noted, that she was experiencing anxiety about giving evidence. In particular, she had expressed concern that she was the only member of nursing staff from her employer that was being called to give evidence, even though there were other nursing staff who had contact with Mr. McKellar after she had, because she had only had contact with him the day before he died.
Yeah. Why wasn't it the nurse who was on shift at the time when
Presumably
he died?
he never mentioned further that he had more chest pain or something.
We don't, I didn't read into his inquest.
And so it was like she was the only one who actually wrote anything about the fact that he had any, no cardiac history or whatever.
I wonder if the medical officer who was on duty when she was on duty would have been called as well.
Yeah.
Because they prescribed some diazepam.
Yeah.
And it's like,
and I think that was found to be nothing significant, that diazepam prescription. That medical officer may have been.
Yeah. But maybe she didn't feel enough of a connection with the medical officer staff.
Yeah. And it was more so the fact that she was the only nurse that was being called.
Yeah.
And she wasn't the last one who had contact with him.
Yeah.
And it sounds like, she was stressed after a 5-hour meeting with a barrister.
Yeah. So we get into a little bit of what was discussed there.
Yeah, because potentially the barrister wasn't particularly supportive.
Potentially, or the barrister was just doing his job and she misconstrued what he was saying.
Yes. Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But again, it's so hard to say because we don't have her side of what happened. So in one of Mrs. Maynard's letters to the coroner, which she had written just before she died, she described some of the stress that she was feeling. So moving on to the preparation for the inquest. So in early June 2015, Mrs. Maynard prepared a draft statement in relation to Mr. McKellar's death and provided it to her legal representatives. On the 17th of June, Mrs. Maynard's lawyer spoke with her and took further instructions in relation to her statement. The lawyer then sent an amended version of the statement to Mrs. Maynard on the 19th of June, and Mrs. Maynard signed it and sent it back the same day. That's all very standard. It's not uncommon for lawyers to make amendments to witness statements because, there's certain form procedures and things like that. So it doesn't actually go through what those amendments were, but this is all very standard.
Yep.
On the 17th of July, Mrs. Maynard's lawyer was informed by Mrs. Maynard that she was being called as a witness, and arrangements were made for Mrs. Maynard to meet with a barrister to prepare her to give evidence. This included taking Mrs. Maynard through her statement and preparing her for any criticism she may face in relation to the care she had provided.
So are they sort of preempting what they think the other lawyers are going to ask, and
Correct.
just so that she's prepared for...
Correct.
These are the types of questions you're going to
That
face.
you could be asked, and
Yep.
that this is the type of way that you
Yep.
should answer them if you are asked these questions. So this is all very standard,
Yep.
but I know it is also quite confronting
Yeah.
when you're being told this is what you're going to be criticised for.
And you're just thinking, I didn't do anything wrong.
Yeah, exactly. And your natural human reaction is to be so defensive, but it's also the barrister is doing his job
Yeah.
Yep.
in adequately
In preparing
preparing
you.
you and telling you you might be criticised for this.
Yep.
It's not a criminal investigation as well. I'm like, oh, that's hard.
Yeah.
It's not, but
Yeah.
it's all recorded. If there
Yeah.
is something
Yeah,
that
no,
flows on, like, yeah.
Yeah, if there's any inconsistencies, the coroner's going to find them.
Yeah.
Exactly. At this time, Mrs. Maynard expressed that she was upset that she was the only nurse being called to give evidence at the inquest, and she expressed that she thought that they may be gunning for her, although it was not clear where she got this assumption from. The lawyer who was present at the meeting maybe thought that, like, the barrister said something using that phrase.
Oh, like
As
they'll be gunning
gunning
for
for
you
you,
in the
In,
they will
yeah,
be
maybe in
asking
the
you
context of,
questions.
you know, they're going to be, you know, quite strong. He might start yelling, like, that is his job. It might seem like they're gunning for you, but they're not. Like, this is how you need to answer the
Yeah.
question, and she's misconstrued that as being they're
Well, I
gunning
wonder
for
if
you.
she had any issue with her employer, if there was any employment issues, and she thought the employer was going to gun her for her.
There wasn't any evidence of that, but
yeah, but I wonder like, in
knows
her
what
mind
her-
if that
her thought process
perception
was.
Yeah.
yeah. It was explained to Mrs. Maynard that she should not read into the fact that she was the only nurse being called to give evidence.
Yep.
She shouldn't read into the fact when she's being cross-examined that the barrister is acting this way. That is his job.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that was all explained to her
Yeah.
in that meeting, but it might have been one of those things where she kind of heard the information, then blanked over and then didn't sort of take in.
Too
Absolutely.
stressed by everything that was
Yeah,
happening to
exactly.
be able to... Yeah.
The lawyer also told Mrs. Maynard that she may face some criticism from other witnesses just in relation to writing that observation about no
Yeah.
card. There's going to be other witnesses that are going to give evidence. They're going to be asked direct questions about that. There may be some criticism, but no one is gunning for you,
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
what was reiterated to her. But again, to the
Yeah.
extent that she actually took that in is unknown. So it was explained to Mrs. Maynard that Mr. McKellar was having a coronary event the last time that Mrs. Maynard saw him, and this raised the subject of possible clinical error on her part. Again, it's potentially something that could come up in the inquest, preparing her for it. However, the lawyer was not sufficiently worried that Mrs. Maynard may be adversely impacted to the extent that the barrister decided not to have a discussion regarding self-incrimination with Mrs. Maynard. So basically, the barrister thought there is no way that any of the evidence that she could possibly give from the story that she's given us, that she's going to be seen as being criminally negligent.
Yeah,
at
because
all.
she wasn't.
Because she wasn't.
Yeah.
And so he was like, I'm not even going to bother having the conversation with
Yeah.
her because it's not relevant.
Yeah.
Because we know that if you are a witness at a coronial inquest, you can request to state something so long as it won't be held against you
Yeah.
in a criminal court
Correct.
of law. Is that right?
I'm
Yeah,
pretty
and
sure.
then the coroner has to grant that as well. And so the coroner
because
also
you've still
can
got
give
the right against self-incrimination,
Yeah.
even at a
But
criminal inquest.
the average person isn't going to know that.
No, they're not going to
Yeah.
know that. And
So that's why the barrister would need to bring it up, and they haven't
Correct.
even bothered.
in
Yeah.
circumstances
'Cause they don't
where
need
they
to.
think that you could potentially incriminate yourself, yes, they'll have that conversation. But in this case, he was like, that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to have that conversation. And probably I also gleaned from that she was probably so stressed that he was like, I'm not even going to.
Yeah, if I go
Yeah.
there, it's going to be making things worse.
Freak her out.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they didn't even have that conversation. The lawyer noted that Miss Maynard was very nervous about giving evidence. However, the lawyer noted that this is very normal. It was
Right.
actually more abnormal if the person wasn't very nervous about
Okay.
giving evidence.
Yep.
That is actually really good to know. Like, yeah, is it on a spectrum? No, it sounds like
No.
for the most part, it's
It was
pretty stressed.
it was pretty normal. She said that she had not seen signs suggesting that Mrs. Maynard was contemplating self-harm or that she was unwell in any way.
yeah, right.
So it was
'Cause
all like in the context of very normal interactions that they'd had.
would the lawyer or would Judy have they had concerned about the mental health.
I'm sure they would. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Just
Yeah,
like
cool.
any other person, right? Like
Yeah,
if you're
well,
concerned about
profession.
someone's mental health, in a professional
manner.
context.
Yeah.
So it was clear that she was stressed about this upcoming event, but there were no sort of red flags indicating potential self-harm to her legal representatives. The coroner also considered Mrs. Maynard's physical and mental health in the months before her death. So in one of the notes that Mrs. Maynard left to her husband, she made reference to the fact that she was having some health issues and had lost a significant amount of weight. She had visited her GP 7 times since March 2015, with the last consultation occurring on the 11th of September. No concerns had been noted by the GP about losing weight. However, Miss Maynard was recorded as generally wanting to lose weight. Her main complaints were that she was having trouble sleeping due to working night shifts. She was prescribed medication for that, and she had not mentioned any anxiety issues or didn't even mention to the doctor that she was appearing at the coroner's inquest. At no time did Mrs. Maynard's GP have any concerns for her physical or mental well-being, nor did she show any signs of any concerning behaviour or give any indication that she was a suicide risk. Mrs. Maynard's nursing colleagues noticed that she had lost weight and they'd spoken to her about it, but Mrs. Maynard explained that she was on a strict low-calorie diet for health reasons, which obviously wasn't the case. Anyway, Mr. Maynard agreed that his wife had lost weight in the months leading up to her death, but he said she told him that she'd had a stomach bug.
Oh.
That caused her to lose. So there's inconsistencies
about what's
with
going
what
on.
happened. GP notes recorded that she had lost about 11 kilos during her visit on the 20th of July. The autopsy records her weight as about 4 kilos heavier than that at the time of her death, and she was like a little bit overweight.
Yeah.
At that point.
Did the autopsy, was it a full autopsy?
No, it was only an external and
there
toxicology.
could have been something that was going on. Like there could have been a legitimate medical issue behind her losing weight.
But if she was riddled with cancer, an external autopsy would include a full body CT generally.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, right.
So they would have found something.
Yeah.
That would make sense. And that would be an alternate reason for her actions. Then.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that's really difficult though, because the GP is going to be seeing her for like 10 minutes and she's probably putting on a pretty good front of I'm totally fine, I'm losing weight, it's intentional.
I'm on a diet.
And you know, if you're anxious, how often are you opening up to your GP?
Unless they're asking you a very pointed question.
But
and even
the
then
GP
you
doesn't
might
know
not.
any of the background behind this.
Yeah, exactly.
So
the GP's
he doesn't
not
know what
looking
questions
out
to
for
ask.
it. Yeah.
To even get there. So he's just seeing it as normal weight loss. The colleagues are like, she's on a diet, she's trying to lose weight. The husband's like, oh, she's been sick.
Yeah.
So she's lost weight. Yeah.
It's so easy to spin a story
spin
around
doctor
who
stories
you're
are different, what they're like more likely to believe. So basically the coroner said it's difficult to determine why she lost the weight, but it very well could have been an indicator of anxiety.
Yeah.
Rather than any of the stories she actually told. So like this anxiety could have been something that was ongoing for a long time.
Yeah.
Rather than just a decision that she made within a few days. So Mrs. Maynard had also consulted with a psychologist on 2 occasions on the 9th and the 16th of September. So in the month of her death. So this service was accessed through her employee assistance scheme counselling service. According to the psychologist, Mrs. Maynard had not indicated any suicidal ideations or intent to harm herself. She had again mentioned that she was nervous about giving evidence at the coronial inquiry. She was particularly concerned about giving inaccurate information during the inquiry, apparently. So the psychologist assisted her by providing some basic relaxation strategies to allow her to collect her thoughts before giving answers. At no point did Mrs. Maynard indicate that she was being pressured in any way to change her statement or, you know, had sort of any other real concerns.
Yeah, I think that's totally, like, you talked about the barrister was prepping her for the cross-examination where they're looking to try to find inconsistencies. And so I can understand why you might have that stress that you might say something wrong, that then someone picks into minute detail
that's
about.
That's the main stress that you'll say something wrong or you get caught in a trap.
So I can understand why she was feeling that way.
Of course. At the second appointment, Mrs. Maynard said that she was feeling better physically but had recently had a bout of food poisoning and she had lost some weight.
Right.
She did mention that she had gone back to her written statement and had decided to clarify a few things. She said that she wanted to resubmit the statement as it was a more accurate reflection of what had occurred.
Okay.
Interesting. I wonder, do we go into what she changed?
No,
Or
because
did
she didn't
she
actually
never-
end up changing it. She just wrote that additional letter to the coroner.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
And just on a side, stomach issues can be a symptom of anxiety.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
You're so
that-
stressed you don't
That
want to
stomach,
eat.
but also that you
can't.
throw up, that
Yeah.
you're nauseous, that you're, so
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
symptom.
It checks.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the psychologist noted that at the second session, Mrs. Maynard had seemed more calm. However, at neither session was she displaying particularly high levels of stress. So it wasn't like she was super over the top.
Yeah, she was
Stressed
good at
out.
hiding it.
Yeah, she's very
Well, I was
good at
like-
hiding her emotions.
Again, conjecture and allegedly, but by the second appointment, had she already started making plans?
Yeah, possibly.
She's
Yeah.
feeling calmer because she knows what she's going to
She's-
do on the
she's got her way
28th
out.
of,
Yeah.
the 29th of September anyway.
Yeah. So a third session had actually been booked for the 29th of September. However, the psychologist was unwell and cancelled the appointment.
Ugh,
A follow-up appointment was made for early October. So yeah, you don't know.
you don't
Yeah.
know. But she'd already
She'd
booked
already
the
booked the
appointment.
hotel room,
Yeah, sorry, the
so-
hotel room,
Yeah.
yeah.
At that point.
So
but
what
like
difference would it make?
from the psychologist's point of view, you'd be like, oh, that would have been one last chance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
Or it could have been that she disclosed she'd already taken the insulin, that kind of stuff.
and it could, yeah, you just don't know. Something I also mentioned previously was that Mr. Maynard had seen Mrs. Maynard researching euthanasia on the internet at home. He had obviously found her doing this, and she had just told him that she was curious about the subject because she was a nurse.
Okay. Yeah, like that is a legitimate
It's
reason.
an explanation.
But I wonder which detail she was going in. Is she
Well,
looking
yes,
into the
true.
detail of how they do it, or
Yeah, so she was,
or
I
like
think
the
she was
legality
researching
or-
specifically insulin. And
Yeah,
that's again why
yeah,
they
okay,
sort of connected
okay.
the dots there. Colleagues of Mrs. Maynard also noted some unusual conversations with her where she mentioned that it's possible to use insulin to terminate life. Don't know the context of these conversations, how it happened.
I've had a lot of conversations with my work colleagues that, out of context, would
Sound not good.
Yeah.
would sound not good.
Yeah.
I can understand when you talk with your colleagues.
Yeah.
The insulin to cause death in a nursing circle
Yeah.
Yeah. that's
actually
not abnormal.
isn't an unreasonable topic of conversation
Yeah. And none of Mrs. Maynard's colleagues recall having any concern for her welfare
at the time. Yeah.
around these conversations. One colleague noted that she was aware that Mrs. Maynard was anxious about the inquest and had access to counselling through the employment assistance scheme, but nothing further than that. Another colleague recalled that Mrs. Maynard had invited her to the cinema to see the film Last Cab to Darwin, which I actually have at home. It is a very good film.
That is really good.
It's a really good film,
Can
but-
recommend.
But it's a film about euthanasia.
Yeah.
They didn't end up attending the film together, but in hindsight, the colleague thought it was a bit unusual that Mrs. Maynard had, because Mrs. Maynard had never invited her to the cinema before. Again, I think you
Right.
can't read anything into that.
It's all,
No.
it's all with hindsight, right?
Yeah.
All of these things are like, they weren't actually concerning until
No,
you then put
until
that
you put
together.
them all together and you're
Yeah.
like,
Hang on.
oh, so her husband told us that she was researching euthanasia, and then we were having this conversation about insulin deaths.
Yeah.
And then she wanted to go watch this
she
movie
wanted to
about
be
euthanasia.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you're sort of like, okay,
Okay.
but taken separately.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And euthanasia is very different. Euthanasia is in the context of generally having a terminal illness. And so you are just selecting to choose when it is rather than
Yes.
it's pending.
Yeah. And yeah, so basically the coroner did not accept that any of these conversations would have been cause for concern
Yeah.
by any of the involved parties. So no concerns there. But it was also evident from the views expressed by Mrs. Maynard's colleagues that she was an experienced nurse, she was a good worker, she took great pride in her career, and any criticism of her professional attributes would have been a concern to her. A number of colleagues noted that they had never been critical of Mrs. Maynard's professional abilities, and they all agreed she was a competent nurse and there was no evidence that she was not coping at her work.
Right. And she was working up until this point?
Yeah. So colleagues understood that her anxiousness around giving evidence was not so much about her clinical judgment and more about her having to recall information from a number of years ago and her ability to accurately recall that information. So again, she's not even concerned about the events that happened, but she's just so anxious about the cross-examination or the examination on the stand and saying the wrong thing.
And the way
Yeah.
that she might come across
Yeah.
to other people.
Yeah.
And we've definitely discussed the hindsight or giving evidence that's delayed and how much of an impact memory has on these things.
But that's also taken into account by the coroner.
Exactly. I
Yeah,
was
like
like, there is no coroner in the world that is sitting there being like,
Why don't
well,
you
you changed
remember?
your story.
Yeah,
You
this
must
thing
be
happened 5
lying
years ago.
versus let me think about how much of an impact that has had
Yeah.
over that period of time. And they surely must all be aware of that potential.
Exactly. But again, she doesn't know this.
It's that thing where, you know, if you're an innocent person who says being investigated for murder and they ask you, what were you doing on this day 3 weeks ago? If you hadn't done anything wrong, you won't remember.
You won't know.
Because it will be a normal day.
Yeah. And that's the thing. So even when these inquests come up and you get told, because he died the day after, not on her shift. So it would have been any other day.
Yeah.
Nothing dramatic happened
No.
on that day. Nothing dramatic would have led her to burn that into her memory. It would have only been however many months later when the coroner goes, you know, we do want a statement from you, that she goes, I've got to remember that thing that I did 3 months ago on a day that was any other day at work.
Yeah.
And so you're reliant on the notes that you have from the day. So no one's expecting her to have
All the
perfect
answers.
recall.
No.
But it also just might be that personality type
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
where she's like, I need all the answers.
Yeah.
I need, like, if I answer something incorrectly, that, like, my world's going to end.
Yeah.
absolutely.
So it obviously sounds like there's potentially other mental health
Yeah. Stresses.
stresses on top of this, but she's so good at masking it
Yeah.
from everyone, including her psychologist and GP.
Yeah.
Yep.
So the coroner commented that Mrs. Maynard's death is a shocking reminder of the potential counter-therapeutic impacts that people may experience when they become involved in the coronial process, such as giving evidence. In the case of health professionals, research has found that the more involvement an individual has with the deceased, the higher level of stress they reported from the coronial investigations, which included severe anxiety, long-term emotional impact, stress leave from work, and change in employment.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fair.
In Mrs. Maynard's case, she was receiving support in the form of counselling through her employer, and she was also being legally represented in the process through her union, who could counsel her through the coronial inquest process. But even with those supports in place, she still experienced distress at the prospect of giving evidence. There may have been other stressors in Mrs. Maynard's life, but it was clear that the primary stressor at this point was giving evidence at the coronial inquest.
And it may have just been like that was the main thing, but there were all these other
The
things
minor things.
Yeah,
that have
that we
been
don't
going
know
on for a
about.
while, and then this was the tipping point.
I mean, there was talk about, you know, her relationship with her husband had broken down previously and they'd reconciled and sort of stuff like that happening as well, but it really seemed that this was the primary stressor. The coroner remarked that it's inevitable that some level of stress will occur for parties involved in the coronial inquest process, but the coronial process is an important one and requires investigation and witness evidence to explore whether there are feasible ways to prevent comparable deaths. Witness evidence is a necessary part of the adjudicative process of the coronial inquest. So it's basically saying we have to do this.
Yeah.
This is the way it's done, and it's done this way
Yeah.
for a reason. At the time of Mr. McKellow's inquest, there were no direct counselling services available to support those involved in the coronial process outside of the families that were impacted. Since 2016, which is obviously just after the death, but before this inquest came out, the Office of Industrial Relations has provided funding and facilitation for grief and trauma counselling for people affected by work-related fatalities. This is likely to include potential witnesses at coronial inquests. A referral brings with it an automatic approval of 10 hours of counselling. This service is generally taken up by families of people who have died in workplace accidents, but it is also available for others who have experienced a death relating to their work.
Okay.
So this isn't in relation to the coronial process so much, but in relation to workplace deaths.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I assume that's outside of a hospital?
I
Or
would
is that
assume
still...
so.
Because, like, she was in a prison, but she was acting in a medical service. So I wonder if... Because, like, that's every day in a hospital, depending
Yeah.
on the department you're in. So I don't know if that... Is that...
Yeah.
Could that be offered
I'm not
to-
sure.
But I guess how could you exclude them either?
You can't exclude
exactly,
them,
because it's
but
still their workplace.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
the coroner noted that many employers also offer counselling services, like Mrs. Maynard's employer did.
Yep.
But this is obviously not universal, so not everyone's going to be supported by their employer with these sorts of things.
And I also still think there's probably some concern, even though they're technically independent to your employer, there's also some concern around the stigma of using your own
Yes.
employer's counselling
Absolutely.
service.
Yep.
Absolutely. So from all this, the coroner recommended that the Queensland government facilitate and fund a program that provides counselling services for families as well as witnesses and other people who may be involved in or impacted by a coronial investigation. I had a quick Google and there definitely are programs in place now, but they're still very much directed to families and not so much to witnesses. So it's hard to know without actually ever providing witness evidence at a coronial inquest what support
You actually get.
is actually offered to witnesses in particular. Because obviously families are supported very well, but I think witnesses are kind of left behind a little bit in the process.
And even if it is, no matter which angle you're coming from, like even if you are a party that's made a mistake,
mistakes happen. That's kind of the point of the process.
or your organization, you're the CEO of an organization and it happens to have had some deficiencies or whatever. And so like whilst you get, like held responsible or whatever, you may not have like directly been involved, but you would have significant psychological consequences, I would have thought.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, so that one was a bit different than the ones that we covered, but I think it was very relevant, just obviously in the context of
Coronial, absolutely.
Yeah.
coronial in general. And I thought it was very interesting to sort of think about, because it's not something you think about.
No.
This one was still super relevant and
Very relevant, just not as like hard hitting.
It's still pretty hard hitting.
Yeah,
I
think so.
Gives you a lot to think
It's
about.
just in a different way, the cause or the reason behind it. It's all very relevant. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed or at least learned something from today's episode, and we will catch you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.